Welcome back, everyone, to Dangerous Thoughts here on Unsafe Space. Maybe I should put the logo on. There we go. I'm Carter Laren. I took a couple weeks off. I'm your host. I took a couple weeks off to visit America for Independence Day. So we got to experience life outside of California. Spent some time with a dear friend and his family. And I'll admit, sometimes it's hard to stay motivated to fight for Western civilization when you live in the San Francisco Bay Area. But it's refreshing to be reminded that there is actually a culture of liberty out there in small towns. Maybe they don't have a lot of philosophical discussions around the barbecue, but there's a visceral appreciation for America and the unprecedented form of political freedom and individual sovereignty that it offers. So that was good. I'm glad to be back. Welcome back, all of you. Hopefully here on Dangerous Thoughts, we can continue to help people defend that individual sovereignty, both intellectually, philosophically, maybe psychologically, I don't know, because ultimately we're engaged in a battle of ideas, and we need as many people to be armed as possible. And to that end, I'm particularly excited about today's episode because we brought back one of my favorite guests, one of the foremost philosophical defenders of individual sovereignty alive today. His name is Dr. Stephen Hicks. Before I bring him on, just please take a moment to make sure you are subscribed. If you're watching on YouTube, they like to unsubscribe people, so please go make sure you're subscribed and share your favorite episode with a friend of this show or any other show. And please consider supporting Unsafe Space, any of our series. Just go to unsafespace.com/fight, and you can help us fight for Western civilization. Okay, so without further ado, as I mentioned, this evening I'm speaking with Dr. Stephen Hicks. Dr. Hicks is a professor of philosophy at Rockford University in Illinois. He's also the executive director of the Center for Ethics and Entrepreneurship and senior scholar at the Atlas Society. He's the author of 6 books, including his forthcoming book, 8 Philosophies of Education, which I was hoping would be out, but it's not out yet, so I'll ask him about that. And including a book that I've mentioned before, I happen to have sitting over here, Explaining Postmodernism, Skepticism and Socialism from Rousseau to Foucault. As I've said in the past, this is a must-read for anyone who's interested in kind of understanding the philosophical roots of the authoritarian left and the craziness that you're seeing today. He's published in several academic journals, including Business Ethics Quarterly, Teaching Philosophy, and Review of Metaphysics, as well as a bunch of mainstream publications. He's host of the Open College podcast. You can find him and follow his work at stephenhicks.org. Stephen, welcome. Welcome back.
Hi, Carter. Thanks for that gracious introduction.
It's just a bunch of facts about you. So I don't, you don't need to thank me. Pat yourself on the back.
Well,
you're
thanks, man.
pretty cool. So look, last time we discussed an overview of kind of the Enlightenment, and we defined it a little bit, and we moved on to postmodernism and critical theory, and we got into that. This time I want to focus more on some questions that I've been thinking about on my it's been a relatively recent journey that I've taken to try and educate people about the philosophical roots of Western civilization and defend it, overtly. I used to sit around and code and do other stuff. So this wasn't really what I dedicated my career to. I've been struck by a lot of questions. Some of them I have answers to. Some of them are questions from the audience that I keep getting pushback, but some of them are just things that bother me. And one of them is, let's just start with a big one. Why do so many people view philosophy as pointless? And they kind of, there's a big disinterest. Like, they're happy to talk about politics. They'll argue about a Supreme Court case or a law or whatever, or, they're happy to argue about that stuff. But the minute you step back and say, let's have a discussion about philosophy, because that's what actually pertains to all of this and we need to apply it properly, their eyes glaze over often and they're like, this is just a boring thing unrelated to my world, and I'm going to go away now so I can scream at the other side.
Yeah. Well, I think, one of the reasons is that much of philosophy is pointless crap. So we'll start off with the negative.
You can't say that while I'm taking a sip.
So, if you look at
okay,
much of the main philosophical schools that developed over the course of the 20th century, most of them were explicitly self-destructive. They say we have no answers to any of life's questions, and so some of them just get into pointless word chopping, and they they're self-consciously just doing that, or they go off into self-indulgences of various sort, or they end up taking themselves seriously and ending up in various sorts of nihilism. So, while there were some very healthy developments in 20th century philosophy and early 21st century philosophy, overall, it was not a good century for philosophy. And so I think thoughtful people listen to a few philosophers and say, well, if that's what philosophy is, the healthy reaction is to tune it out. But I don't think that explains the whole thing. I think there is another issue that for most people, time is short. And so the available bandwidth by the time you become an adult, particularly for thinking about deep, hard, abstract issues, is relatively limited. So the more important thing is going to be what kind of philosophy people get exposed to in their teen years. And especially since we are fortunate to live in a society that is largely free and very wealthy, we do have this whole 10 to 15-year-old span of life where we can explore lots of ideas and grow up and find ourselves, the way the hippies nicely put it. And for most of us, that is a very philosophical time when we're thinking about does God really exist or not? What kind of person do I want to be? What values are worth pursuing? Does love really exist? And that all of that is very philosophical, and most of us are fortunate to be able to do a certain amount of it. Now, if they don't get good guidance at that point, if they run into the dead end philosophies or the cynical philosophies, then of course they're going to shut down. So I think probably we do live in the most philosophical generation ever, just because we have had people raised in a culture that is free and rich, and they've had more time than probably anybody else has had. At the same time, though, philosophy is hard. There is a reason why there's a role for professional philosophers and professional public intellectuals in that intellectual and cultural division of labor. And I think we just need to do a better job, those of us who are in that profession, at rehabilitating the role of philosophy in most people's lives.
I mean, it makes sense that philosophy kind of, I mean, you can see that it's self-destructive. I mean, deconstructionism is almost explicitly self-destructive. I mean, like, they even pick names to kind of indicate what they're up to.
Sure.
And so I guess that makes sense. I mean, the sad thing about what you've just said is it's nice that we're rich enough that we're not working out in the fields at the age of 8 and never having any time to sit and think about these things. So we do have that period of time as in the teenage years and early adulthood. But largely that's directed by state institutions or state-funded institutions that haven't really been, let's say, giving us the best there is.
Well, no, yeah, that's absolutely true. I mean, obviously, there are some good public schools out there and good teachers, but overall, public education is at its best under-delivered relative to the time and resources that have been poured into it. And to put it more strongly, I think it has dehumanized human beings, young developing human beings, to a significant extent. I mean, it's almost a cliche about 5-year-old kids who go off to school and they're all excited, yay, I'm going off to school. And then by the time they get to second grade, they hate school. And the best thing that can be said about it is that they learn very well how to tune out school as much as possible. And to a large extent, they're doing that in self-protection mode. And so their human development is not something that happens very significantly in the classroom. They will get snippets, right, of course, but it will happen in their extracurricular activities, if they pursue music or sports, and it will happen outside of the school. So children, I think, in Western civilization, and that's becoming world civilization as each generation goes on. I think they're still getting well educated, but it's not happening in schools. And schools, I think, are a net drag on educational development. Now, fortunately, I think everybody knows this now. And everybody is starting to do something about this in the last 5 years. So as bad as things are, I am optimistic because now at least millions of parents are stepping up, and thousands of entrepreneurs are stepping up and challenging the status quo, introducing reforms, and starting brand new systems. So I think we're going to turn things around.
Yeah, I mean, I think COVID actually there was a silver lining to the lockdowns, which is the parents got to see.
Yeah.
You're like, oh, this is what's going on in school. This is horrible. Like,
yeah.
So that's so. You said a moment ago, philosophy is hard, and I don't disagree with you. I'm not a professional philosopher, and it seems hard to me. There's certainly some of it seems rather not difficult. But there's a lot that's really hard. That's like, there's some like nuanced cases and weird stuff. And actually, if you go beneath the surface, it gets harder and harder often. And it's like, some of it can seem pretty straightforward, and then it gets a little bit more difficult. Probably like physics. Newtonian physics is pretty straightforward, but then when you start having to calculate probabilities that wave function probabilities in quantum mechanics, it gets difficult. So I've heard a lot of pushback because I argue for a rational philosophy, and that I'm from the, I'll say I have an objectivist background. I don't like to use the big O objectivist thing because I'm not a big fan of a lot coming out of ARI, and they kind of have a monopoly on a pseudo monopoly on objectivism. But a lot of people will say, well, it's too hard for, and this sounds very elitist, but this is, I hear this a lot. It's too hard for the masses, right? It's too hard for ordinary people to live by a philosophy of reason. It's too intellectual. It's too nerdy. You have to sit down and talk about individual sovereignty and where that came from, and then understand how to apply philosophy to, everyday life. And it will never really work. This is why religion is better, because there's just a set of rules. You just follow the rules. And people don't have to figure it out for themselves. So the arguments are basically, it's too hard to divide the ethical, to derive the ethical rules yourself. And if you're just accepting the rules from someone else, you don't really know. It's no different than accepting some other set of rules. And that there's this inherent kind of psychological need for belief in something bigger than yourself, or a deity or faith, or even a lot of people that say that they're not religious have kind of moved into this spiritual but not religious thing, where they're like, well, the universe there's some prime cause in the universe and blah blah blah, and they speak to that as being this deep psychological need. So I guess it's those two things: the difficulty of it for quote regular people, which is what I hear, and the psychological need for meaning that comes from a belief in a deity.
Yeah. Okay. That's three very thoughtful questions. If I'm parsing them out.
Sure. It's all one big ball. Sorry about that. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think I'm on the other side of all three of those. While I see the force of those positions. So let me say a few things. First, on the difficulty point. I don't think there is anything in philosophy that is beyond the capacities of a normal person with a normal intelligence. The kind of evidence I would give of this would be any parent who has had six, and if you just eavesdrop on the kinds of discussions kids are having, they're having very sophisticated discussions about morality, fair play, what's yours, what's mine, did the rule get broken or not, and all of it is very sophisticated at an age 5 or 6-year-old level. Now, these are still 5 or 6 years old. Their lives are not that complicated, but the basic principles are getting ironed out. They can understand them. And as life gets more complicated, we are just scaling up the same kind of understanding that we're capable of doing at age 5. That's to talk about kind of moral principles. So just to use a personal example, I can remember my daughter and a neighbor kid when my daughter was 6 and the neighbor kid was 5 years old, sitting out in the sandbox in the backyard. I was a little bit off to the side in the shade, having a beer on a hot summer day. And this was when zombies and zombie video games were all the rage. and they were having a discussion about whether zombies were alive or not. And they were, one side was arguing that zombies were dead, and the other side was arguing that zombies were alive. One that was saying that no, their souls have left their body, and all you have is just mechanical bodies in motion. And so there's a kind of dualistic understanding, soul and body, and that's what makes a human being. And the other kid was arguing, this was my daughter, that no, the zombies are still able to move themselves and decide where to go, and they want to eat your brains, so they must be at least a little bit alive, and that maybe being alive or not comes in degrees. And so these are 6 and 5-year-olds getting into mind-body issues, life and death, and so on. So those issues can be sorted out. 8 and 9 and 10-year-olds start to realize they have different religions. Is there really a God? Is there one God more than God? Or are there no gods or gods or not? So to go back to the example you were using about physics, yes, by the time we get to quantum mechanics and say relativity in physics and so on, all of that is very sophisticated and cutting edge. But if we talk about the kind of physics that most people are confronted with, can I navigate stairs and opening doors? And and we can learn how to do all of that, and that's physics at age 3. And again, kids in a sandbox doing very sophisticated engineering things, building sandcastles and moats and running water through it and learning about hydraulics. And then by the time we are teenagers, we can learn how cars work, the brake system, the electrical system, and so on. And so all of that is physics and increasingly sophisticated. So I think philosophy is exactly like that, right? The basic principles we can grasp when we are young, and we can scale up as our intellects will mature. And of course, once you get into the very sophisticated issues, philosophy does merge into physics. Philosophy does merge into neuroscience. It does merge into knowing lots and lots about history, and their specialist knowledge becomes important, but everybody can do it. Now, that's just the first of 3 things that were in your package as well. So let me pause there, though, in case you want to jump in on that.
No, I like that answer, and as a parent, I definitely, one thing that I love about being a parent, and actually just love about young kids, is and a lot of people think I'm crazy for saying this, but they're naturally rational. And what I mean by that is, like, they expect a reason. They expect there to be cause and effect. They want to understand it. They don't have any of the context of knowledge that we have, but they certainly have this expectation that there should be a reason for why did this happen. And as any parent knows, why is the favorite question.
No, and that's exactly right. And that was I was almost about to say that. Once they learn that why word, right, it becomes their favorite word. And to some extent, this is mechanical. They just, whatever you say, they're going to say why, right?
Yes.
And then pretty soon you're talking about, cellular chemistry and so on.
Yes.
And you say, I don't know why.
I remember,
point, right? but they've got it, right? And they are being little philosophers all the way down.
Yeah, no, it's great. I remember specifically a conversation I had where my daughter asked why a school bus was yellow. And it did not take many whys to get to me just saying, I have no idea. Like, I don't know.
That's a beautiful thing.
We got down to the wavelengths of light and why this respond, blah, 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 I'm like, and psychological effects of colors. And I would just threw my hands up and I was like, you know what? I don't know.
That's right.
I don't know. So,
and that's also then a philosophical lesson for the kid. If their parent, says at some point, I don't know, but encourages the kid to keep asking questions like that. So then that's also learning about morality and sociability and the ethics of reasoning, in contrast to parents who teach different philosophical lessons, who basically say, shut up, kids, stop asking so many questions, which is to train in a different philosophy.
Yep. Yeah. I think I wasn't a perfect parent, but one of the best decisions I made was before my first daughter was born. I said, I'm never going to say because I said so. I'm always going to answer why to the best of my ability.
Good. All right.
And I think, well, fingers crossed. She's not a mass murderer or anything, so I think it's okay so far. So all right. So I would agree with what you're saying. in general, the one caveat I want to question you about is, once they've gone through childhood and I don't want to be too harsh about this, but have had their reasoning capacity stymied, have been discouraged from using it, have been molded by, I'll say, toxic ideas and psychologies.
Yeah.
Is it possible to take an adult like that and get them to reason, or is it kind of lost and very difficult?
Yeah, I want to say that's going to be outside of my area of expertise, but my hypothesis is that it can be lost, that it can be a use it or lose it type of faculty. So the analogy, I think, would be if you stunt people's physical development at a certain point, you can't get that back.
Yep.
So it's like if you've never develop basic coordination, for example, not even going in the direction of stunting. You're never going to be, if you can't start at age 40 and learn how to play golf, if you've never had basic physical coordination, there's just too many things that need to come together gracefully. And so by analogy, I would say if there are parts of your brain and your psychology that have not been practiced and developed at the right developmental stages, then my hypothesis is sometimes it is going to be too late. Now, the example I have of this is, every year or so, I teach a course in logic. And one of the things I've noticed over the course of many years is that all of the students who take logic will either get an A, a C grade, or an F. And there are very few who will get a B or a D. So there's a kind of modal distribution of the grades. And the other thing that I notice is that that's tied partly to effort and partly tied to acquired ability at, say, age 20 by the time they're taking this university logic course. Because the students who get an A, they get an A pretty much effortlessly. They can see what the logic problems are. They can think abstractly. They can develop the theorems and so on. And they put in a minimal amount of effort and they get it. The students who get a C are the students who will struggle. They'll do all of the exercises. They will come in for extra work. And they will get a C, which is an average kind of grade. But you always get the sense that even if you were to put additional time in it, they would never become an A student in logic, that their cognitive capacity for abstraction and following long trains of thought has reached a certain limit, and they're just not going to get there anymore. And then the students who get an F are typically not students who are not able to pass the course. That becomes an effort issue. They just haven't tried very hard, and so they get an effort. So it's interesting that it doesn't seem to be, this is obviously a small data set. We're talking about a few thousand students perhaps over the course of my career, but the person's cognitive capacity for abstraction and following chains of thought peaks and it becomes set. And I'm not convinced yet of the data that says that can be dramatically expanded beyond age 20 or so, but I'm open.
Well, I mean, I think what you're saying comports with studies that I know have been done about language, and certainly there's if you don't learn certain language nuances, you actually can't. Like,
Yeah, sure.
I think like an adult Japanese person who never was exposed to the difference between the sound L and R can't differentiate, and there's no learning there. They just can't even hear it.
Yeah, and some of that seems to be physiological, right? That the auditory parts of the brain, right, the connections don't get made before puberty. I understand it is, and then after they can't be developed. So.
Yep. Yeah, and it's important, I think, to remember that every experience and every time we learn anything, and the way our brain works is it is a physiological change. That's how the brain works. So, that makes sense. Before we move on, there's someone has a super chat, and I just want to get to it because I promised people I would try and let them ask you questions if they wanted to.
Great.
So this one is from Zyben64 says, have you looked into bicameral mind or other theories of human consciousness and its relationship to culture?
I have not. I understand the big name associated with that is Julian Jaynes, and I know some people who are enthusiasts. And I know that I had a copy of the book back when I was in graduate school, but I've not gotten to it, so I can't say.
Okay, I don't have any info on it either. Okay, so that's that. So that I guess the next, so that's the question about, are the rules too complex for most people? Is it too difficult?
Right.
What about this idea that there's an internal, innate need to believe in something bigger?
Okay. Well, I do think human beings are born with all sorts of needs, cognitive needs, emotional needs, physical needs, and so on. And I think we do need to believe in something. And so I think philosophy, having a set of principles to guide your life, knowing who you are, what your values are, and some semi-explicit, at least, worked out understanding of the meaning of life. I think that is a human need. That we all recognize that in us. And if we don't develop that need, then we are going to feel all sorts of psychological problems and so on. But the question then is, what's going to fill that need? And this is where all of the different philosophies have value, even if they are false values. So there are such things as placebo philosophies out there. You know, they push your buttons, but they don't provide you with the genuine psychological value, right? Or they are the equivalent of empty calories. It feels like you're eating something and your taste buds and your stomach is satisfied, but you're not actually getting the nutrition. So many religious philosophies, I'm not going to say all religious philosophies, and then many secular philosophies are fulfilling a general need. However much they don't follow through, if they're not true, they're not going to be able to follow through on those values. So I think fairly quickly we would need to get to the specific kinds of answers and how they provide, you know, at best, partial satisfaction of that genuine need. So, for example, you know, not all religions have the same metaphysics even, or the same epistemology, or the same understanding of human nature. So to speak of religion in general, I think is inappropriate. But if we take, you know, say what I think of as the healthiest kinds of religion, this is going to be the kind of person who says, you know, I look out at the world, and the world seems to be cause and effect. There are laws. It seems to be that if human beings are going to achieve something significant with their life, they need to have healthy values. And if we're going to do these things socially, we need to have agreed upon principles and so on. And so we need to have kind of a physical structure of the universe and an understanding of it, and a moral structure of the universe and an understanding of that. And so that, I think, is all healthy and philosophy. Now, if you then say, the next step, well, where do these principles come from? You know, why is the world cause and effect? Where do these moral rules come from, and so on? Then, of course, one of the big moves in philosophy is to say, well, we need to go to a divine source and have an underwriter, right? A kind of a scientist God
Right.
who made the world and laid some rules on it. Now, I think cognitively that's a mistake, but I can say that kind of religion is healthier than a different kind of religion that will have a very different starting point, right? Which will then be to say something like, the world is irrational and it makes no sense. And morality just seems to be human beings devouring each other, and we're all just monsters. And so what are we going to do about this? Well, we're just going to believe in some sort of irrational God who's very whimsical and doing all of these miracles, and that human beings are beasts who need to be strictly controlled by authoritarian religious leaders and so on. I think that also is a religion that is false, but it's also coming from an initially unhealthy place. And that's a very different kind of religion than the first kind of religion that that we talked about. But at the same time, setting aside religious answers to those questions, there are going to be people who aren't religious at all, right, who will say the world is irrational and conflictual, and human beings are beasts to each other, and I'm in favor of some sort of authoritarian dictatorship, but they're purely secular. And that person, I think, is much less healthy than the kind of person who's going to have a different kind of naturalistic metaphysics. So I think we would need to get to specifics about the bigger meaning. At that point, we're just saying, well, there's this philosophy. Is it true or not? And to the extent that it's not true, it's not going to provide a genuine sense of meaning. So another form of this, and I think this was the middle part of the question, is to say people find meaning by becoming something larger than themselves, and they don't necessarily mean a deity, right? There's a God who's going to provide meanings and obligations and lay it on you, and you just kind of fulfill God's rules, and that's how you find meaning. I think that's ultimately empty. But there also are going to be people who have a secular version of that, and they will say you find meaning by merging yourself into some sort of social grouping. And it is true that there is great value, psychological value, because I think we are social beings, to having healthy social relationships. But right again, we need to parse this out. I think there are healthy and unhealthy ways of forming those social groupings. There is a kind of person who wants to have meaning in their life, but they don't do the individualistic work of forming their own character, forming their own values, finding genuine, meaningful pursuits in their life. And so they have this need for meaning, but they are individually empty. And so they then will try to get a meaning for their life by merging with some sort of group. Because then what they will do is say, well, there's the group and it has its values, its way of living. And it's kind of like going into the department store and buying a ready-made suit, right? And I just put the ready-made suit on, and now I'm a certain kind of person. And there are social roles that are accepted to me. And all of that, I think, can work up to a certain point, but it's ultimately going to be empty, right? Because you're wearing a suit, but you're still an empty suit, to use that kind of metaphor. At the same time, there are all kinds of social groupings out there that are individuals coming together with shared values. But as individuals, they already have developed their own sense of who they are and have recognized whatever that social grouping is about a genuine value. And you want to pursue that value with other people who have independently shared that value. And I think it is true, given our psychological constitution, that that can augment the experience of that value. So just to take an example of music, if I just go to a concert because all of my friends are going to a concert and everybody tells me this is the kind of music that I am supposed to like, well, I'm only going to get a superficial social experience of music. On the other hand, if I have developed my musical appreciation and formed my own musical tastes, it is one thing, and I can get a great deal of value just listening to that music all by myself. But there really is something to going to a concert where everybody else is enthusiastic about that kind of music and feeling part of a group where you have that shared interest. That gives you both the individual experience and a socialized value experience. So it becomes complicated pretty quickly.
One thing that I was contemplating when you're talking about the value of kind of belonging to a group and the social value that can replace or provide meaning or pseudo meaning, is that a lot of atheists, I'll exclude myself and presumably you. I haven't heard your politics, but I can guess. A lot of atheists are actually state theists. They seem to have substituted the God for worship of the state as an entity, worship of the, they love the idea of math being the dictator of ethics, and they love the idea of centrally enforced ethics by some authoritarians. Even if it's a mild version of it, they become state theists. I mean, a large percentage of them are outright Marxists.
Yeah. No, I think you're right. To take Marxism as an extreme example, to say that that is a secular form of a Judeo-Christian ethos, that's well worked out territory. But I think your point is right, and that this is where it becomes interesting philosophically about what comes first, one's metaphysics or a value framework or a politics, and I think a well worked out philosophy will be foundationally metaphysical and epistemological right from the get go, and develop the rest.
Yep.
But that's not necessarily the psychological order that it works out in many people. So we do know that there is a psychological type of person who does not develop their individual competency. And so if you don't develop yourself as an individually competent person, I can make my own way in the world, including making my living, just to focus on the economic issues. If that's your core self-assessment with respect to that issue, then you naturally are going to want someone to provide for you. And that can take a religious form. The Lord is my shepherd and the Lord will provide. And God is my father, and religion is a kind of economic providing function in that for that kind of psychology. But that same kind of psychology can be combined with the idea, well, I can't really buy into the belief in a big provider in the sky, but I still feel that lack of competence to look after myself. And so I want someone else to provide for me. So I'm going to need some sort of powerful agency to provide for me, and so I'm attracted to the state as a provider for that.
Right.
So in that case, the metaphysical issue is not the primary, or whether one is a theist or a theist. Instead, it's driven by a psychology, but that psychology is grounded in a personal assessment of your nature as not being able to provide for yourself.
I'm actually I didn't have this as a planned question, but we're kind of going into this territory, and it's fascinating because I've been pushing philosophy as the ultimate answer to this, although I understand the time horizons are very long, right? I mean, philosophy takes generations and generations to kind of change and affect culture in any meaningful way. But I'm starting to wonder if what's really happening is a dance between philosophy and psychology, in which there's a certain psychological characteristics that help people to gravitate towards or even invent bad philosophical arguments in order to satisfy their psychological needs. And then this kind of redounds upon itself because now those arguments and philosophies are out there, so they attract and maybe even encourage other psychological dysfunction, and you get this kind of cycle over generations of kind of bad philosophy mixed with bad psychology, and they rely on one another. Because if we look out at the culture now, it's not just bad philosophy. There's a heck of a lot of really dysfunctional psychology that we're seeing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Oh, again, that's another interesting network of questions and observations, right? All built in there. So the first part of your commentary, though, was about the pace at which philosophy works its way through the culture, and I think that is accelerating. Partly driven by technologies. So I think it's true that back in medieval times, communication was slower, and so ideas, good or bad, took a longer time to develop. Institutions changed more slowly, and so cultures changed more slowly. But it is interesting that as we got more modern communications and more flexible cultural institutions, the rates of change have been quicker. So, for example, if we in education, for example, and I appreciate the plug for my forthcoming book on 8 Philosophies of Education, there are all sorts of relatively new philosophies that were developed in the late 1800s and on into the 1900s that within a generation or two had a major impact. And the development and dissemination of those ideas would have taken a century or more in pre-modern times. So I do think the pace is changing.
That's an excellent point.
So
I hadn't
the rate of
considered.
adoption of new technologies, we're all familiar with those curves. Well, ideas are a kind of technology, and philosophy is a kind of technology. I think it's subject to that same dynamic. Now, the second part of your question about the interplay of philosophy and psychology. Now, this is very, very interesting. Sometimes we can put it as a chicken and egg question, right? Does philosophy drive psychology, or does psychology drive philosophy, and so on? But also, I think there is a kind of taxonomy issue here that philosophy is narrower in the sense that it is a part of your psychology. It is your explicit, abstract understanding of the universe, yourself, and your value framework. And of course, that's always part of any given individual's psychology. Right? So philosophy isn't a free-floating thing. Ideas are in individual minds, and those individual minds are a fully operational psychology. So in that sense, philosophy is always operationalized in a psychology. So it's not that we can just do philosophy in isolation from a psychology, or have psychology in isolation from a philosophy. So they are embedded. Now, then at the same time, what we often mean is to say that a person's psychology, by which we mean the full network of their perceptions and their emotions and their habits of speaking and their conscious beliefs, some of them more abstract than others. So that entire constellation integrated with a certain body. And so there are kind of psychophysical habits and so on. If we take the individual as he or she is developed at a point, does that determine or dictate what the content of their philosophy is and can be? So given a certain kind of psychological type, that type of person is necessarily going to believe certain, or within a certain range, certain philosophical ideas. Or to go the other way, is it the case that we can do philosophy? We can think abstractly about arguments and evidence and then reach certain conclusions. And then having reached those conclusions, use those on our psychology and then reshape our habits, reshape our actions, reshape our perceptions of the world, reshape our emotions, in which case philosophy is ultimately determining of psychology. So that's the second way of thinking about that issue. Now, on that second set of issues, I think it can go both ways. I think it is the case that people can take their existing psychology. You're 25 years old. You've had a lot of years of developing habits and emotions and beliefs about the world. And you can say to yourself, I'm going to stop thinking too deeply about certain things. I'm just going to take my psychology as I am. And then that is then going to limit the range of philosophical ideas that you will entertain. And even if you do come to believe something a little bit different, which ones you're actually going to operationalize and work to change on your habits. So people can decide psychologically to become static with respect to their philosophy, and then their psychology is dictating their philosophy for the rest of their lives. But it is always possible. I think human beings are volitional beings, that people can use their philosophy to change their psychologies. And there are lots of examples of this. People who change their minds about religion, or about how important money is in their life, or what they want to accomplish before they die. So they think about various things, and they reach some uncomfortable conclusions, and they're uncomfortable to them because they make them feel emotionally unsettled, or they realize that it's going to require changing a lot of their habits and reevaluating their social relationships. But they say, no, I think the more important thing is to go with my philosophical conclusions. And so they take their philosophy first, and they use that to change their psychology. And I think that's always an open project as well. Let me ask, is this light too harsh? Should I adjust?
If it's too harsh for you, it's too harsh. I mean, You do look kind of like you're in a Stanley Kubrick movie at once in a while, but
okay. While you're formulating your next question, then let me adjust a curtain, and I can
okay,
still
sure.
hear you though.
Well, I'll maybe go back to something that we touched on that I think I sent you an email, so this is not a question you haven't heard, but you know, I recently as I thought more about philosophy and the status of Western civilization, I've been coming to this I've been increasingly convinced that it's not these crazy philosophies that are the real enemy. It's not the postmodernism and the critical theory, as crazy as they are. It's pragmatism. Because I meet very, very few people who are willing to talk in terms of principles and then attempt to apply them consistently. There is I don't know if you remember in the beginning of Philosophy Who Needs It, Rand has this not long, but she's got a bunch of examples of little cliche slogans, and then you say you don't need philosophy, and then she has these little slogans, and you got that from this philosopher, you got that one from this
From
philosopher,
Hume, from Kant, from Dewey,
yeah,
and so on.
yeah.
Yes.
And so I'm this idea that consistency doesn't matter. What's the consistency is the hobgoblin of a little mind, I think.
Yeah.
I forget which Emerson said it. Yeah, right. So this idea that you don't actually have to be consistent and you can pick and choose aphorisms that suit your situation seems to make it very, very difficult for because when I think of defending America, I think of this like, okay, look, individualism is a principled thing. We need to figure out how to apply individual sovereignty and in all these cases, and this is a principle, and we can argue about the application of the principle, but that's the principle we're trying to apply here. And often though, you get people saying, well, but, and they pull off some aphorism from somewhere else, and they have this idea that, well, things need to be balanced. You don't want to be too extremely individually sovereign. Everything needs to be balanced. You don't want to be too much of this or too much of that. There has to be, some kind of a balance. And to me, that opens the door for absolute lunacy, because you get these out of context little aphorisms that are taken and then people run with them and apply them whenever they want.
Yeah, well, that's a rich set of territory, and I like very much that you're using pragmatism in its kind of proper technical sense as a philosophy, right? And it is a principled. It sounds a little bit paradoxical, but it isn't, right? It's a principled decision, right, not to be principled. The idea then is that we have to not worry too much about the long term, because we can't really plan for the long term. We need to focus on the short term, or that everything is changing so much that we can't abide by a principle that we used last year in evaluating the situation this year. And so we are, as a matter of, maybe principle is not the best word, as a matter of policy, we're going to be more range of the moment. Now, of course, there are people who are pragmatists. I'm putting this in quotation, in a default kind of way. They don't want to exert the effort to think long term and make a plan and to follow through. And sometimes, of course, you make commitments that you that are going to exert a cost that you didn't anticipate. So they want to be hypocrites. And so pragmatism in that sense is a cheap default position. But at the same time, there is a more philosophical form of pragmatism. And I think you are right that it's in a way, at least an equally serious adversary to postmodernism, which is just an outright skepticism and an embrace of power and chaos and ultimate nihilism. But pragmatists don't typically see themselves as going the whole postmodern hog. They want to see themselves as sort of being in that balance position, as you were putting it, between people who are, from their view, hung up on there being these universal general principles that we are going to have a high sense of integrity and sticking with, versus kind of loosey-goosey, let it all go, power politics kind of postmodernism. And that is what pragmatism is. Now, the Greek root word here of pragma is being focused on what works, right? What's practical. And I'm all in favor of doing what works and being what is practical. But then the question is whether it is possible to come up with more general principles to cover great wide range of circumstances. So very general principles, very long range principles, and whether all of those principles are consistent with each other so that we can have a consistency. And that takes us into all sorts of serious philosophical debates. Now, one of the arguments, this is why philosophy becomes important here, is that the philosophical pragmatists will say, anytime you start talking about general principles, you're talking about these great, huge abstractions and these great, huge inductive generalizations that are supposed to hold for all times. But if you are a skeptic, or you have bumped into all of the standard skeptical arguments, then it's very easy to come to the conclusion that, cognitively, it's just not possible for us to come up with well-justified, very general, universal principles. Right? The best we can do is come up with principles that apply to a fairly narrow range of cases, and beyond that, we're just blowing smoke in various ways. And what that then means is they will put limitations on the power of reason or on the power of cognition, and have more of a tunnel vision. So all we can do is understand what's going on in this situation and work out some rules of thumb to solve this set of problems right now. And then next year, we're going to have a different situation, and we'll have to work it out again. And there's no way of saying that there's some overarching principle that covers all of these cases, right? And so on. Now, the other issue is not so much an epistemological issue or a cognitive issue, but a more metaphysical issue about evolution. Many people will get to their pragmatism by saying, so much changes in the world, and basically everything changes and nothing abides. So there really aren't any constants in the world. So this idea that we can learn from history, 200 years ago, 2 millennia ago, is just a pipe dream. So yeah, we know that there were the Egyptians and the Greeks and the medievals and so on, but things were just so different then that any of the principles that might have applied in that context, the facts on the ground have changed so dramatically that none of those principles apply anymore. So the principles themselves need to be, from this pragmatic perspective or pragmatist perspective, evolutionary themselves. And then that will get pushed not only to kind of social principles, but even to the idea of physics principles or biology principles. And many of the first generation pragmatists did come out of the first generation after Charles Darwin. So the idea then, there's kind of one set of nutritional principles for all animals that are fixed for all time. That's ridiculous, right? So animals evolve, and what their nutritional needs are evolves over time. And there's going to be a relativity across species as well. So if you generalize on that, well, maybe the chemical principles of the universe and the physics principles and the mathematical principles, everything is subject to change. And so what's true at one time is not necessarily going to be true at another time. And so you have a kind of an evolutionary practice, a pragmatism that evolves. So that's then to do a quick thumbnail boosting of pragmatism, even though I don't think those positions are true. But you're right to say that kind of position is ultimately going to undermine, the example you use, the founding principles of the United States, to say that, there are human beings, and that human beings by their nature, all of them, and that's a great, huge, whopping generalization, all of the human beings, even though you haven't met any of them. Right? And the pragmatists are going to start immediately being skeptical and say, well, how do you know that all of these human beings are the same? And they have the same needs, let alone the same rights and so on. That's just too hubristic, an epistemological generation. And then also, how do you know that human beings haven't changed across time? Maybe human beings and what their needs were back in the 1700s changed, as a result of social circumstance and physical evolution and so on. And so the right kind of social principles is also going to change over time as well. So yes, absolutely. The idea that there are absolute universal principles and we should be sticking to our guns and be persons of high principle with respect to all of them, that is going to be undercut by any sort of philosophical pragmatism.
Something that's striking me when you describe the pragmatists is the massive sweeping universal induction they're making about things changing and there can't ever be any like
well, there is a paradox there about how
yeah.
you formulate that. That's right. Yeah, there are no general principles. Well, yeah, that's right.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's kind of what's being said.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I don't know how much longer I have with you. So I don't want to.
Let's do one more question. All of this is very fun, but let me actually just follow up a little bit on this pragmatism. One thing I would say, there are some philosophical issues there, and they are perennial, and some of them are legitimate about when we are in a position to generalize too much, and hasty generalizing is a problem. There also is the standard problem of having general principles, but applying them in a very mechanical fashion, right? Rather than to use the Rand language again, putting the measurements back in and exercising judgment appropriate to the circumstance. So sometimes the pragmatists have good criticisms against clunky generalizations and clunky universalists. But if you think about the things that have genuine meaning in life, if you are to go back to say relationship issues, you want to have a genuine relationship. And we all know that these things require commitment, and they require, so if you start to function as a serious pragmatist, you say, well, baby, I'm good for the next month, right? But we'll have to re-up after a month because maybe things will have changed, right? Or I can commit to you for 6 months and so on. You are going to put severe limitations on the kinds of relationships that people are interested in entering into with you. Or in terms of your personal character, if you say, I'm going to be flexible with respect to honesty and fairness, and I don't want to be too strict and absolutist with respect to that, it is going to undercut your capacity to engage in genuine values for the long term. One of the things that
you might run for office, though, with that.
That's right. And the same reason why we are disgusted by the majority of politicians is that they are pragmatists, and they're not actually human beings of principle.
Yeah. No, I can see the clunky. There are a lot of clunky generalizations, and I can see the criticisms of those. So I can see why that's legitimate. But yeah, it is a concern to me that there's not instead of attacking the clunkiness and saying, okay, well, here's where you're making a mistake, and here's what you can actually generalize. Like, we don't need to get into the abortion debate, but it's a great one to have in I think personally in ethics, because it's, if you start with, well, all human beings have a right to life, it's like, well, what does that mean? Where does that come from? What does it mean to be a human being? Why do they have a right to life? And like those need to be peeled back to arrive at answers. You can't just use those words and pretend you've solved the problem.
Exactly right. And so the hard philosophical work has to be done. Yes. Yeah. And it is part of the explanation for pragmatism is that it is a reaction against that proper philosophical work not having been done. Right.
Yep. Yeah. We've got another question from the same chatter who says, is natural selection and is-ought connected?
Natural selection and is-ought connection. So what do you mean, like Darwinian evolutionary theory?
That's what I'm understanding, but I'm not sure how it would be connected to is-ought.
And then the is-ought issue. Well, this is a big question, and I would say yes. That my understanding of moral philosophy and the principles that we get, all of the oughts, this is what kind of person I ought to do and the things that I ought to strive for, do need to be factually grounded. They need to be grounded in is statements about what kind of human being I am, what my biological capacities are, what my psychological capacities are. And then also the same thing for you if we're going to do various things socially. So all of those things about what's proper for us as human beings are going to be grounded in a proper understanding of what it is to be a human being. And if we just get away from natural selection narrowly and say biologically, then yes, I would want to say a healthy moral theory or proper moral theory is going to be biologically based, but using biological in a fairly broad sense. It is about living one's life, and that and we are biological beings. So ethics is a broadly construed biological science.
Yeah, and I think that's something that differentiates rational ethics from maybe a more spiritual approach, where it's about something disconnected from your biology, whereas a rational ethics is, look, here we are on Earth, we're on this ball. It doesn't even actually matter whether evolution got us here. Here we are. This is our nature. This is what's required for our nature. This is where we start from, right? Is this understanding of what our nature is, right?
Right. And then in non-religious forms, those who will separate our psychology from our biology, right? So say, I have certain emotions and passions and so on, and I don't see how that's connected to anything, but I'm going to go with those. So yes, again, more fun philosophical work.
That makes sense. All right. Well, look, Dr. Hicks, I'm going to throw you one big question, and then we can be done. Okay. What's the biggest philosophical threat to the West right now?
Oh, to the West. I'm backing away from using the West language over the course of the last 20 or 30 years or so, just because I think to talk about Western civilization is a bit of a misnomer. I think it's true historically that Enlightenment principles were first articulated in the West, but I do think they are no longer Western. They're in East Asia. They're in some healthy parts of Africa and Latin America and Australia, New Zealand, and so on. So
in some parts of the West, I guess, as much as
no, that's true. That's right. They're atrophying there. So, but with that caveat, what I would say is that's a hard one. I think I would say cynicism is probably the biggest, and cynicism I think is initially a self-defeating value, right? It's a position that people arrive at where they will be disgusted at other people's failure to live up to certain ideals, and they then get overwhelmed by that, and so they give up on expecting much of other people, but then also they give up on expecting much of themselves. And then often cynics will then say, well, what's the point of me becoming the best possible person I can be? And so you basically end up underachieving in your life and even sabotaging your potential. You don't then think you're going to develop your mind to take on life's challenges and achieve goals. You're going to short circuit your ability to have genuine long-term career satisfactions, personal relationships. The cynicism is going to be corrosive all the way down. So my answer for now then, and this is the thing I see many of my students struggling with, which is the why that comes to mind, is they at age 20 or 23, they're usually bright young people at the beginnings of their lives. And if they adopt too much cynicism too soon, then it poisons them. And then unfortunately their life is over, or at least it is, it's damaged significantly. So the counterpart to that is how you preserve, despite awareness of all of the negativity out in the world and all of the hypocrisy out in the world, a healthy sense that you can become something special in your life, and that it's worth it, and that there are, however rare you might think it is, other genuinely wonderful people out there that you can find and connect with. Keeping that flame alive and never letting that go, I think that that's fundamental. So cynicism is the threat. a benevolence about yourself and other people is the antidote.
Yeah, I like that. I mean, the way you're describing cynicism, I'm thinking it as like this proto-nihilism or this like necrotic kind of.
It is.
Yeah.
Although, just to say one more thing, I mean, cynicism is a step away from nihilism in that it still recognizes ideals, but it tends to see them as impractical ideals or unrealizable ideals. But there still is that kind of implicit respect for ideals in cynicism that stops it from becoming completely nihilistic.
That makes sense. Well,
All right, look, we need to have another discussion at some point in the future.
I was just going to say, I need to get you back.
All right, great.
I will definitely have you back. Thank you so much for your time.
A real pleasure, Carter. Great questions. And yeah, that hour just flew by.
It did.
All right.
It always does. Thank you, sir. Have a great evening.
All the best.
All right. Everyone, thank you for those of you who joined us in live chat today and those who are watching on replay. Tomorrow, there's Token Minority Report with Beverly and Alex at 4 p.m. Monday, Narrative Dissonance. I'll be back at 2 p.m. Pacific. Please take a moment to head over to unsafespace.com, support this series. You can also go to, I put Stephen Hicks' website below at stephenhicks.org. You can go there to find out more about him. And if you enjoyed this conversation, please share it with a friend. Thanks again, everyone, and I will see you back next week. Thanks, Dr. Hicks.
Adios.
Thanks for sticking around until the end. If you're new to Unsafe Space, check out our deep content library that includes discussions with everyone from James Lindsay to Brett Weinstein. And please consider helping to fund our work by visiting unsafespace.com/donate. You can find us on a variety of social media platforms, and you can find a community of like-minded individuals on our Unsafe Space Discord server, which is open to financial supporters at any level. We hope to see you there.
Warning. This is an unsafe space. Dangerous ideas have been detected. The content of this production is known by the state of California to cause unregulated ideation that may be harmful to bureaucrats. Association with the following individuals or tacos is strictly prohibited. Apropos of nothing, I was just wondering, how would you feel about another pandemic? Your president is in full control of his mental faculties. If you think about it, no one should be allowed to express opinions. But don't. Think about it, I mean. That's not your job. Thinking has been scientifically proven to be less efficient than compliance. Science, scientific, and scientifically are registered trademarks of the World Economic Forum. Unauthorized use is prohibited. Computer voice courtesy. Never mind, that last line is fake news. Please disregard it and return to your safe space immediately. There will be cake.